worked, produced knowledge on, and nurtured the land where Emory's Oxford and Atlanta campuses are now located. In 1821, 15 years before Emory's founding, the Muskogee were forced to relinquish this land. We recognize the sustained oppression, land dispossession, and involuntary removals of the Muskogee and Cherokee peoples from Georgia and the Southeast. Emory seeks to honor the Muskogee Nation and other indigenous caretakers of this land by humbly seeking knowledge of their histories and committing to respectful stewardship of the land. So yesterday at the COP26, US and China made a very surprising announcement that the two countries would work together to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions to hopefully reach the Paris Agreement goal of 2 degrees. Of course, no details are given, and we don't know what's actually going to happen, but John Kerry said something that really struck me. He said in quote, "The United States and China have no shortage of differences, but on climate, cooperation is the only way to get this job done." If we were like usual years, we would be sending students to the climate negotiations. And it was in Glasgow. It is in Glasgow this year, right now. We had to make a very hard decision to not send students this year, partly because of COVID, but there were also other concerns that the observers are not really allowed to get into the negotiation room. And I've been told that that is exactly what's happening right now. The observers are having only access to the side events and the pavilions, and with no access to get into actually the room to observe or to make voices heard. So we are at the point where we need urgent emissions reductions and also financial aid towards the global south, not only to mitigate emissions, but also to be able to adapt to climate change. At Emory, students have been pushing for climate action, and I've been so proud for what they are pushing for. And this week and last week, we've been able to do some very exciting virtual events as well. And thanks to these gifted students, I think we've been very successful, and I'm so glad that we're able to have this hybrid event today. And there is always a silver lining. We weren't able to go to Glasgow, but today we're able to be together in this room with a very esteemed environmental activist and an artist, Cannupa Hanska Luger. I've been so excited about this event since Megan O'Neill told me about it last year. And I was blown away at the event exhibition on the first day. With the work of Mira Shields, Each Other, and the opera Sweetland, I was very struck by the emphasis on collaboration. And I wondered, this is what is lacking for climate negotiations and climate crisis. We are not able to collaborate. And are we really able to collaborate in the higher education too? I think we are really in the need of collaboration. And I think we experience that every single day, how important collaboration is at every front, at every single time. So this is also why I'm so excited to hear directly from him, who's been enhancing this collaboration all his life. I have many people that I would like to thank for making this event possible. As always, Leah Thomas does all the work behind the scenes. So thank you very much for that. And also the social media, Kiara Brust, does all the social media work, and I'm very thankful. And I would also like to thank Elizabeth Holner, Beth Michelle, and Megan O'Neill for allowing us to have this event on this hybrid format for Emory Climate Talks. Before we go into today's program, I wanted to talk about some logistics. We have quite a few folks on the Zoom. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask questions on the Q&A section on the chat. And we will try to have the Q&A with the unmute if possible. If not, we will be sharing your chat questions on the floor. This, as we noticed, this is being recorded, and then it is going to go online in a few days. So I think I've been too excited about this hybrid format, so I talked too long. So let me introduce our speaker, and so we can actually get to hear from him. So Cannupa Hanska Luger is a multidisciplinary artist based in New Mexico and uses social collaboration in response to timely and site-specific issues. Based on the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, he's an enrolled member of the 3 affiliated tribes of Fort Berthold and is of Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, Lakota, and European descent. Luger produces multi-pronged projects that take many forms: ceramics, videos, sound, fiber, steel, new media technology, and repurposed materials. And through these, he interweaves performance and political action to communicate stories about 21st century indigeneity. His work provokes diverse audiences to engage with indigenous peoples and values, apart from the lens of colonial social structuring. Many of his work also often presents a call to action, as you can see in his exhibition. And if you have seen the exhibition, you would know that Cannupa combines critical cultural analysis with dedication and respect for the diverse materials, environments, and communities he engages. It is such a great pleasure to be able to have the time with you, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I need to share this.
Dosha Maragua. Can you hear me on the microphone? Yes? Okay, good. From up here, all I can hear is my own voice. Dosha Maragua. Dishgag Nahu Dosha, Nitawehu Dosha, Cannupa Hanska Luger. I'm Awache Dripping Earth Clan from the Mandan Hidatsa Rikara tribe, where I am a citizen, a card-carrying member. Awache is Dripping Earth. So my clan is my, it's like my function in our society from a customary lens. What clan you were born into is also what your function as a member of your society is. And mine's Awache, Dripping Earth. Our function for our society was to build our earth lodges. So we would build villages with these huge earthen buildings that had living grass and sod along the top. They were packed with clay, and as the clay began to erode, it would drip down the interior wall of the earth lodge. And the way it dripped, it created those sand castles that you would play with at the beach. Awache is that, the dripping earth. On the slideshow, it's just going to cycle through. It's going to show different images and projects that I worked on. But I think primarily the intersection that I would like to communicate with all of you is environmentalism as privilege, environmentalism as an extension of colonial powers, and what that means in the 21st century relating to economies that are developing that are considered green economies. And then the question of where have those green economies been derived from? What indigenous populations with tens of thousands of years of research and application, so not just theory, but practice of a way to exist with your environment that's sustainable, have been co-opted and repackaged and redistributed to a population in a moment where the demand for sustainability is at a pinnacle. I think about this in relationship to some of the conversations that are going to be brought up today around these accords, around the protection of 30% of the world's natural environments and resources. How does that look different than land seizure and colonial exploits from our past that will be repackaged, recontextualized, and applied once again, affecting 300 million plus people who are living sustainably within these environments, but will be removed in order to preserve them. I've seen the application of environmentalism and conservation brutally remove indigenous populations from their environment, populations that have, for time immemorial, developed sustainable ways to engage with the environment, take only what's needed, use everything that they take from it, produce something more beautiful in the exchange, and acknowledge and respect the kinships of more than human species. What parts of indigenous knowledge and indigenous cosmology has been overlooked and reduced to primitive thinking, when in reality, it's empirical science that's been applied through not just theory, but practice for tens of thousands of years? Prior to contact in the United States, my people had a tradition of starting fires. We would ignite undergrowth. We would burn tall grasses where they were beginning to pile up, where nothing was eating them. Nothing would eat them as dead grasses. And rather than domesticating an animal on this continent, we chose to participate in the natural cycles of our environment. Through observation, through patience, through living, we understood that there was another system at play, a system that wasn't human, but was much older than that, older than even our footprints on this land. And it turns out that when you would burn the undergrowth in some of these forests and ignite these fires, it created fresh growth, fresh grasses, fresh undergrowth that the game from those woodlands could sustain themselves on, flourish on. And a lot of what we consider, I guess, national parks and forestry services, we are witnessing right now in the 21st century that fire is now a weather event, that there is a time of year in which things burn because of that lack of stewardship, because of that removal of our bodies, our knowledge, and our extension of the environment has been removed. As a Mandan Hidatsa Arikara person, I'm an enrolled member, and I mentioned this card carrying. I have a certificate of Indian blood, which is absolutely insane to me, on a card in my wallet as we speak. This justifies and gives relevance to the authenticity of my birth and my blood relationship to these communities. A lot of Native people have them, many don't. Those who do have them, all of those numbers, all of those roles, because I was assigned a number, sits in the Department of the Interior. We are still kind of classified as another one of the fauna of this land, where the flora and the fauna are categorized. I think about this in relationship to environmental efforts to sustain other animals, other areas, other landscapes that think about the importance of an apex species on their environment, that consider the trophic cascade of biodiversity being removed from those environments, and wonder at what point do we acknowledge ourselves as that. I think a lot about the environment and how we're watching it shift and collapse at this moment. And I wonder, and this is completely theoretical, but as an artist, I can jump and dive into these imaginary worlds. I wonder if there isn't a hole in the environment, the shape of human beings. What was our function, our purpose? We are this incredibly unique species built almost entirely for adaptation. We've adapted to every single climate across the planet. We've ventured off of the planet into outer space. We've sacrificed our claws and our fangs as a species, any poisons we may have had, We gave all of those up for an incredibly large mind. That mind's capacity is what makes it so possible and so capable of a species to adapt to every single environment. And in the wake of colonialism, instead of adapting to the environments we're like radically exposed to as a global population, we decided to make the environment adapt to us. What strange confusion did we put into play that forced this much larger entity, this creature that is a collective effort of every living thing on the planet, have to adjust to an insignificant speck, a part of that matrix? I wonder how we can become a more whole system, a more connected system. And I'm intrigued to consider how environmental efforts, as a fire set underneath us, to really move quickly and to consider how we shift and change. If we don't start recognizing that our relationship to place, our relationship to the environment, and some of the myths we've been told, some of the myths we continue to tell one another that reinforce our separation from the environment, are not the original course and cause of the violence that we've inflicted on our planet. That in order to be that cruel, you have to separate yourself from it. And I recognize that as an indigenous person who was removed from humanity, considered a wild animal in my ancestral spaces, and the violence that was inflicted on indigenous people then, today, and probably tomorrow, has been continued because of this separation. It is easy to separate yourself from the land because it doesn't have eyes, nose, all of the features that we expect to see in our desire to see ourselves in other things. But when you see that happening to other human beings, I imagine we have gone kind of a step too far. And so I'm wondering, what is the way back? And I think back might be the wrong way to state it. I truly believe we do not have an actual separation between ourselves and our environment. That is theoretical. That's in our mind. It's a part of the myth we tell each other, something that we've reinforced. All day today, I was taking students on an effort to experience the exhibition next door, each other. And before we went into the room, I encouraged them to take a walk into the ravine right by the bridge over here across the source route by George Trachis, made in the 1980s, a narrow path that encourages people to walk down into the ravine. It's so narrow, you have to pay attention to where your feet go, how you take steps. It's not easy like crossing the bridge that runs over the ravine. It forces you to be a part of your environment. When you step down into that area, source route, you have to cross a spring, the stream. Water wells up from underneath, at this point, one of the dorms on campus, flows underneath a library, which I believe I heard today, and trickles down eventually to the ocean. That is natural infrastructure. It takes thousands of years to understand how to redistribute with equity fresh water from one region all the way to the sea and be a part of a much longer system. I think we have that. I think there is a stream in us, a spring that wells up and reminds us that we're connected to the planet, to each other, to the earth. And I think we continuously have to negate that information, deny it, and reinforce our separation. Mostly to become comfortable and complacent within the world we live in. And I encourage people to walk down that path, walk across the river, talked about the relationship to place, and then we walked across the bridge. Bridge is a wonderful architectural design, but walking back across the ravine from that bridge, you separate yourself from the place. That bridge, although it connects one side to another, and I love all of the metaphors that a bridge can represent, it also separates us from the land. It separates from the water. It's so much faster, so much easier to cross that bridge than to walk on the source root art piece. But I wonder what's lost in doing that. And I think we reinforce that separation. And I'm just intrigued and I'm encouraged. I make a lot of artwork. It has all sorts of purposes. I'll be honest with you, I don't consider myself an activist. I know activists. I know folks who put their bodies and their lives on the front line to stand up for something that they believe in. I know the effort and the danger that they put themselves in that place. I don't put myself in that place. I have incredible privilege as an artist. And so I try to apply that privilege as best as I can. How can I utilize that privilege to actually amplify an issue, a project, an environmental statement, and not enter into these spaces as an individual, but enter into it as a collective. I'm interested in creating projects that encourage people to participate in the creation of work. I provide them prompts, and I use social media as a platform to share those prompts. Because I think, from my experience, social media is a river that's wide and shallow. You can like and you can share, but there's no depth of return on that, although it shares a lot of information very quickly. It's great if you want to be an ally, if you want to share thoughts and prayers. But at this point in history, and I believe all of you in this room understand that, we don't need allies. We need accomplices. We need people invested in one way or another. And so my practice is really looking at how can I create a prompt using this medium, using social media as a medium, as a platform to get people involved and participate. And rather than just liking and sharing, giving them an opportunity to spend their time, which is probably the most valuable resource from human beings at this point, greater than any monetary exchange. Give me some of your time, care for a moment, and participate in sharing that empathy. I end up making those pieces become public and travel and do all of this sorts of stuff, but I can't do it alone. And I think it's important to recognize that we have never done anything ever alone. There's like a rugged individualistic myth and narrative that the United States likes to push forward, and a lot of colonial empires that have birthed into new lands. This intrepid kind of going out there by yourself, being able to somehow defy gravity and lift yourself up by your own bootstraps. Like, these narratives are so false and they're so toxic. And they also reinforce our separation and our isolation, and say that if you do it good enough, you will become king. I question that. I question it entirely and wholly. And I want to encourage people to question that into the future, that the world we live in is a myth, and that we can collectively create a new myth, create new ideas, reestablish old understandings, and apply it not just from ancestral knowledge from my culture, my people, those of the Muskogee Creek of this region, but also your ancestors. At some point in the history of human beings, we all worshiped the earth. Total worship. We looked at the land with reverence rather than resource. That's in all of us. And that little song rings out over and over and over. And there are moments we try to collect that experience. We take photographs of sunrises or sunsets, of a wonderful meal that we're about to eat. We photograph that and document it and share it with one another to reinforce this moment, this brief moment of feeling like you belong here. And it's so hard, I think, as Americans, as industrialized countries, as being alive in the 21st century, it's so hard to recollect and remember that you belong to place, that the place doesn't belong to you, that you become an extension of it. And there are brief moments that you get reminded, and you want to share that with everybody, and you don't know how to name it. And I think in this country, we've sacrificed our sense of belonging, which is innate in human beings, to the accumulation of belongings. Let me trade one for the other. As a native artist, I began to understand this because so much of the economy and industry that I began my practice in was the cultivation and the creation of traditional, quote unquote, objects. Native people were relegated to the past, relegated to a historical moment. And the economy that was built around our production of our goods was for a Western market, so that folks could feel connected to place and have a deep time relationship to place. I think we desire that. I know we do, because an entire economy was built around the creation of curios and objects that hold stories with deep time relationship to place. I think we all have those stories. I think we demand that conversation. And I think the opportunity that we've missed is the opportunity to communicate to one another completely, wholly, honestly, to build complexity and contradiction, but to have a real exchange around what it means to have the correct protocols in place to sustain ourselves on this planet far into the future. So there are a few pieces on here that we've been cycling through. These are projects that I have worked on, utilizing different technologies, some of them ancient, some of them using archaic technology and applying it to new, through new mediums. The Mirror Shield project was mentioned. This was built out of desperation, out of necessity, asking people to protect people on the front line of the Dakota Access Pipeline water protectors. This is from 2021 at line 3. Same form, didn't make them. Somebody else did, took the idea, made it happen. 100% for that. I've seen these shields applied in many different regions, many different front lines. Anywhere a line was drawn and we had to reflect what we were facing. So I love seeing them kind of applied in that fashion. But the shields themselves are the first kind of project that I did that made me realize that there was a demand for doing more, that people want to do more other than just liking and sharing. And so I made a video on how to create these sitting in the parking lot of a large box store, one that I knew would be in any big town, big city, where if you didn't have a wood shop or anything along those lines, you could literally use the tools within the system itself, within the large economic system of a big hardware store to build that sort of thing. That began to encourage me to use social media as a platform to encourage people to participate in other works like this one, Everyone, where I asked people to make a bead to represent data collected on missing and murdered Indigenous women. The 4,096 beads that were created with hundreds of people and dozens of institutions within 3 months. I made a video and had the number that I needed. It was a quick response. None of these projects involved institutional help. These projects were developed grassroots, literally just one person, me, my partner, who's an incredible organizer, and in the communities that we were reaching and extending to. The capacity of social media to transmit these ideas and transmit them quickly is profound. And I think we can utilize that in ways where this is not my art, you know, this is our art. This is something that we make collectively. And it's an extension of really old traditions. And I'm happy for anybody who wants to look at data, look at creating solidarity, look at developing accomplices for whatever issue it is that you want to amplify. These models are available. They're ours. And we create them together, collectively. This piece is called Belonging, and it was originally supposed to be in the exhibition that's next door. And it was a look at the removal of bison from North America. At one time in, like, say, 1840, it was the single largest biomass on the planet Earth, bison, 60 million plus roaming across North America. And within 45 years, through a war of attrition, the bison were eradicated by the United States government and settler colonial communities in order to create hunger and starvation in my people, literally, like in the Midwest. It removed our food source, our shelter, our clothing by removing the buffalo, and it also we had to watch this genocide happen to a collateral entity, one that we respected as its own sovereign nation, Buffalo Nation. So it was a show of force, but it also affected our capacity to sustain ourselves on the land. But we're also looking at the environmental impact of that presently. What happens when you remove an apex species from its environment? How does that cascading effect dismantle even the rivers we watched sustain themselves for thousands of years? There's been several kind of projects that I've been doing looking at bison and their relationship. But also, I think, once again, like I had mentioned at the top, what are people? What are human beings, if not a part of that landscape? And how have we been so dislocated from our place that we're no longer contributing to our environment the way we used to, but rather forcing our environment to contribute to us? And so several of these pieces are talking about some of these things. This one is called We Have Agency. This figure is bound entirely by polycarbonate string. It's an extension of the hydrocarbon industry, but she has a knife and she's severing the cord behind her. She was the final iteration of this whole We Have Agency series that was developed in 2016 early in response to the Dakota Access Pipeline. And this was just me really kind of, it was so early in it. I was trying to understand my relationship and my agency in relationship to the story of perceived dependence. It's like, I feel a lot of the politics that was used to create all of the policies that allowed pipelines to run across waterways. The annexing of indigenous land is through eminent domain, that it's for the good of everybody. And the angle on that was energy independence. And I thought, at what cost are we looking at all of this stuff? And we have a group of people trying to protect water, an actual resource that we're truly dependent on for the sustainability of a hydrocarbon industry that we've only needed since the combustion engine, really. And at this point, just reaffirm our dependence on it by saying that we need it. So I've been playing around with a lot of those ideas. I've been considering my relationship to the environment and making works not just with my own hand, but using repurposed materials. All of the materials that you see in this, aside from maybe some hardware and some adhesives, are made entirely out of found objects. So I have a relationship with a felt, a company that uses industrial wool felt in Albuquerque, and they make soundproofing for terrible architecture that was built in the 80s and 90s, but they have tons, literal tons of remnant industrial wool. And I tend to use that material because I've access to it to offset their weight, their waste, and to kind of express this idea of working with industrialized products. This is all wool. It's all harvested from sheep, run through many different processes, machines, pigments to paint it. And rather than asking for that material to be created, I'm trying to figure out how to use what's left over, that which would be discarded. Old Afghans, old sporting goods equipment. I'm pretty much on the scrounge and considering what it means to make out of necessity rather than out of some sort of economic demand for new material. That there are so many new materials that we're throwing away. How do we consider building an imagined future, an imagined culture that repurposes these sorts of materials? So it's not just trash, but maybe this future kind of culture that I'm creating actually mines our waste instead of digging into the earth, digging through the refuge piles of our present to develop a culture. Yeah, I think that's probably where I would like to lay as far as talking at you. And I would really like to open up the opportunity to talk with you, share my input, my insight. I am not an expert on any of this sort of stuff. These are all just kind of perspectives and actually the radical freeing ability to imagine something outside of our present. And I think as artists, that should be our primary function. We exist on the periphery of our society. It's important that we reflect it back on itself, reflect it into our own kind of thoughts. And rather than speaking to you truth, let me speak to you honestly. And with that honest conversation, there's room for change. There's room to be informed greater, and there's room to grow. I think a lot of our kind of human efforts at present is so solution-based. I get yelled at by my wife, Ginger Danil, all the time for thinking in solutions rather than like, she's like, dude, I just want to brainstorm with you. I want to just shoot out a couple of ideas and see what happens. I think about our impulse to create a solution and how that solution ends up changing the future in ways we never would have expected. And I think we really need to be careful about that as we engage with our present climate crisis, our present biodiversity crisis, and consider what it means in kind of a deeper time relationship about those sorts of responsibilities. So I'm open to conversation. I'm open to questions, open to statements. Thank you very much.
So much. I think, sorry for the Zoom folks, those that are on Zoom. I'm sorry that we weren't able to share the slides. Hopefully we will be able to send them later on. I apologize. So I would like to open the floor if you have any questions. And then for people, those are on Zoom, we will be able to take them with the Q&A or the chat function. Is there any question on the floor? Okay.
We have to give you a microphone for all of those in the internet.
Testing. Okay. So I think one of the really cool things about these like big collaborative art pieces is the idea that it kind of takes like two lives. So it has like one for the people that are like working together on it and developing it and seeing it in person. And then like a second one for people like us that are experiencing it secondhand in pictures and stuff like that. And I was just wondering, like, as you develop these works, how do you kind of take that into consideration? And what are the like differing reactions you've seen in each of those contexts?
Yeah. I believe that art and culture and life, I think so much of the impact of like Western society and why I was kind of leaning in hard on colonialism is that there is an incipient, like kind of, there's an entangled space, and we're actually existing in one of them, having these conversations in one of them, these institutional spaces where we want to reduce everything to a noun. Everything is an object. It's a material. It's all of these sorts of things. But from a linguistic standpoint, most of my customary language, Mandan, Hidatsa, Lakota, many indigenous languages, probably many European languages in their root, are not describing things as they are, but in things becoming. We had a more emphasis on the verb of a thing rather than its noun status. So to share projects like this in the making is the closest way to my understanding to share art by the definitions that I would impose on it. Let me share the making. Let me share the process. The object afterwards is moved through these institutional spaces. It's experiences objects and allows as like a conduit or a vessel for all of you to see what had happened and then hopefully be able to absorb some of that information and in a perfect world, apply the same technique to whatever you need to do to be a part of that collective art making. So the difference in it is these pieces can be acquired. Their sense of ownership is built entirely around possession. Right now, the museum possesses it as a platform for you all to experience it. Those who made it with me have ownership of it without ever having to possess it. And that's such a contrary kind of model to our present. But it's totally rooted in antiquity. It's totally rooted in some of our customary practices that you can't have it. And like, that's our relationship to even the planet itself. It's not yours. At best, you're borrowing it from future generations, at best. And so now the question is, how do we develop protocols that make us act accordingly? You know, and so I think by sharing work like this, I'm also creating a conduit for that different sense of understanding and relating to it. And I guess those are the two ways people may experience it. Also, 1,000 other ways people may experience it. And I think it's all valid, you know, whatever your filter is, whatever your experience is. As an artist, I work to communicate, and it's not limited by language. It's being able to build impossible architecture. It is paths and bridges even that, instead of spanning space alone, span time. It engages with my ancestors. It's created for children that haven't even been born yet. So I'm intrigued with that, how we build intellectual or impossible architecture. Yeah, that's the small answer. There's a long one. It takes 42 years.
Okay, so there is a question on Zoom, and then we'll get to you. So Sydney is asking, how do you think we can foster collectivism for those of us moving further into academia? Do you feel that you have more mobility to bring about this change as an artist than those in more regulated career forms?
Once again, we've never done anything alone, I think. So if the path you've created moves you through academia, and that's the angle and the point of engagement that you want to address all of these issues, more power to you, more power to all of us. I think the multiplicity of experience and the variety of ways we can engage with a problem that we want to see and affect change in, the better off we are. There is no one right way. There is a collective way, and many of them are wrong, and only the future will know which was the right. But as long as we continue to engage with that collectively and not try to undermine one another, or at least like horizontally project violence on one another, and actually recognize that we live in a world that is so obsessed with order, complete order, that the chaos of our reality is actually probably the best way to navigate into the future, because it cannot be stamped out with one single effort. So whatever it is, whatever angle it is that you're using to affect change that will benefit all of us, like, more power to you. I appreciate it. It's another thing I don't have to do.
Okay. So my question kind of relates to climate change. So when I hear a lot about solutions about climate change and stopping and reducing and mitigating carbon, it seems like we're still working within a framework that allowed carbon emissions to get to where it is. It's not really about adapting. And when we bring up adaptation, it's about adapting the technologies that kind of allowed us to get to this point. So I guess within your frame of adapting and adaptation, how would you see the future and bring up a solution for climate change?
Yeah, I'm not working on climate change solutions. I think I'm more focused on the adaptation aspect. I am one of billions, and the reality is we're doomed. Like that, but it doesn't need to be negative. I think for generations, human beings had developed incredible funerary practices, ceremonies, celebrate our passage from our time into death. We're like a carbon sink. We're literally, our lives end up putting this back into the earth. Respect that, love it, cherish it. It's going to be a privilege as things get hard, and life was never supposed to be easy. It's a hard go. And the more privilege you have and the more easy it is, the less power and the less strength you actually have. In reality, your ability to adapt is actually probably one of our greatest gifts. So celebrate our passing. I believe life goes on. I believe you're doomed. And it should be great, you know? I think solutions are important. It's good to try. Like I said, I don't think there won't be one solution. But I think our ability and our capacity to figure out how to adapt through the hard times is going to give us an appreciation in a far future generation. If we can plant now the fruits that we will never get to eat, hopefully that will be a bounty for generations that are yet to come.
Okay, hello. I was wondering what got you started in art generally, like what the first, maybe not the literal first piece of art you ever made, but just
I have it. It's in my studio. 1982, drawing of a horse.
Perfect. Yeah. So I guess just like what initially inspired you maybe with that piece, or like in years after that.
Yeah. I wonder how any of us aren't involved with art. I think it's really old. It's older than human beings. Think of like a hand axe produced by like Neolithic human beings, right? The original knife or hand axe wasn't built for stabbing somebody. It was built to like separate and divide and share with the whole. That was the original design and form. And we changed that throughout time out of necessity, out of all these sorts of things. My relationship to art is that it's my responsibility to the contribution of culture. I'm a part of a small demographic of people. There's literally only 15,000, give or take, using data, 15,000 Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara people on the planet Earth. So any work that I do is an extension and the survival of those cultural practices. And so there's a little bit of a responsibility there. But also, my mom's an artist. So she raised 5 kids as a single parent on art making. And my dad is a cattle rancher. So I grew up in 2 strange worlds. And I think the common denominator was hard work. And so I appreciate the opportunity to create art because it actually makes me a better human being, teaches me patience, teaches me care. And it reminds me that out of everything that I consume as a part of this system, I spend more time trying to put more in than I take out. And I think that's the beauty of an artistic life, if applied properly, is that you leave this world contributing more, putting more in than you've taken out of it. And that's like an old customary practice. That's where all of our native arts came from. We never had a name for it, but it was literally, if you kill a deer, you use every single part of it. And the parts that you don't use or that you transform into clothing, it doesn't just get to be clothing, it also has to be illustrated beautifully so that your contribution to what you've taken out to remove a life, you're actually putting more in to community and culture out of respect for what was lost, but also appreciation for what you gained. And so I think most artists should work that way and consider those sorts of relationships. And for as long as I can remember, I've doodled, I've sketched, I've written stories, poetry, now work in clay, make clothing, and work in digital media, like just looking at mediums and trying to figure out how to apply ancestral knowledge through new material and contribute to the kind of wealth and intellect of indigenous knowledge. Yeah.
Hello. Okay. Hi, I'm Narika Encarnacion. It was so amazing to hear you talk. I have a question about since we were talking about linguistics earlier and like the connotation of using the word those at the front lines. is it done purposefully to conjure images of like war and battling? Or like, I don't know the history of indigenous activists in the United States. So I just wanted to ask.
No, from my experience, and it's limited, let me say. I've been in a couple of like political unrest situations throughout my life. And in those situations, there is a distinct front line, like distinct. There are people gathering in solidarity. There are folks who are there just to party. There are folks who are there just to tear things apart. But there is a distinct line that divides between those trying to impose power and those trying to reclaim it. And that is the kind of front line that I'm always thinking about, because it's almost, there is something battle-like about it. But I think that's a response to the hyper-militarization of our police, the kind of military-industrial complex that so much of our tax money goes into, that so much of our sciences are actually funded by, and the effect of our climate crisis is also a part of that system. So this combative aspect, something that I wish we didn't have, but we do, you know? And when I want to talk about the front line and even the ideas of protest or social engagement or activism, oftentimes that's where these sort of interactions actually have teeth, where people who will be harmed are harmed there initially. And then you see that kind of ripple out into their community and society afterwards with the same level of violence. You know, so that's the front of the line.
Hello? Okay. Hi, I also loved your speech. It was very inspirational, and I'm actually interested in becoming an artist, and I wanted to hear about how you got started as a professional artist and how you balance your career with your kind of activism aspect, and yeah, how those two work together.
Yeah, I don't balance it at all. I don't know where one ends and the other begins. I don't know why I'm here having a conversation around climate, in all honesty, other than the fact that I am here right now physically, and the work that I make is relevant to that conversation. Oftentimes it's a matter of negotiating time. You know, what's the time? And how I got to this place is I am so stubborn. I'm like so stubborn. Most of my artistic career was insane. It's insane that you stick it out, you know, in all honesty. It's not an easy journey, but the trick to it is to never stop. That's the trick. There are, at the beginning, there are so many artists. Everybody you meet is an artist, like absolutely, and I believe it. I absolutely believe it. Everybody is. We all have an innate desire to create, to make, because creation is perfect. Like everything else is falling apart, you know? I get that. How I turned it into a viable economic path is that I didn't stop. And every single turn, it's like, you ain't gonna make it. Your relatives are like, that's foolhardy. Your peers are like, I'm challenging you to a duel. You know, one of us are gonna get this thing. Let's see who sticks it out. The reality is endurance. Train yourself on that. Never give up. Continue to create. You are not complete. You're becoming. Become it. Don't be it initially. Become it. And I think for my own personal gains and psychological welfare and mental health, I aim low and give it everything I got. That's my jam. I'm like, let me not aim for the stars. Let me aim for waking up on time this morning. Let me aim for getting that full cup of coffee before I get out to work. All of those little tiny accomplishments, I have a story of success because I've successfully aimed low and held nothing back, you know, and each one of those steps gets me closer and closer to that unimaginable, far distant, hopeful dream of being an artist, you know? So I'm like, celebrate that. Celebrate the little tiny wins in your life and do that over and over and over again. Because if you focus on what you're not, you ain't ever gonna be happy. Most of your life, you're not gonna be the thing that you could imagine in your mind. So celebrate what you are every day and all of those little tiny things that make you become. Yeah. Morning coffee. Watch this success, everybody.
Okay, so Sarah has a question. Since we belong to an institution that constantly asks for solutions from us, for us to produce knowledge and answers, do you have any advice for taking a step back to just imagine and brainstorm?
No, I was clever enough to never go to grad school. So I went as far as my BFA. I got a BFA at the Institute of American Indian Arts in New Mexico, where I currently live, and considered grad school. Really liked the idea of going to grad school. Every time I could carve out enough time and finance to support that, I had a baby. So I got 2 little boys out of the scenario and no debt, and I was a great trade. Because of that, I had to work extra hard to be accepted and allotted into institutional spaces. But once again, I'm very stubborn, and luckily I can like talk, and so much of this space is like jaw work. So much of academia feels like jaw work, research and jaw work, you know. So I can do that. I listen to tons of books in my studio. I haven't read since probably, gosh, 2012, honestly, like a thing. But I listen to tons of books. That's a possibility, and I can make work while I'm doing so. So I do research in my studio while I'm building. I have enough muscle memory to create things with my hands and then have my brain free enough to take in information outside of that. And I got no accreditation for it, but here I am. So it's a possibility. I don't know. So with that being said, I don't really know how to navigate within these spaces as being a part of these spaces. My introduction to it is literally coming in perpendicular and being like, you invited me to the table. Let's see how many dishes stay when I pull on it, you know? And that's a privileged space to come into. So I don't really have any sort of insight or input on that. As far as how to navigate within the system.
Hello, thank you so much. I just want to share my gratitude to have been able to be a part of this conversation. In your talk, you talked about how we shouldn't be invested in telling truth, but rather having honest conversations. And to me, how you've responded and my experience of this space and this conversation has felt that like you've modeled that for me in real time. And as that was happening, I could feel my energy change, my heart feeling a little bit lighter. And it made me think of how much of whatever truth we might want to say with words, art is a medium for communicating truth in a way that other methods fail.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, thank you. I hold a lot of gratitude for
thank you.
this.
I think so too. I think art is an underutilized method of communication. I think there's interest in it, and it's increasing. But I think because artists are peripheral, like I do a lot of work around community and engaging with community and amplifying community, and I don't really actually know where my community is. I've never gone to a place and saw a whole population of people and was like, there I am, there's me. And I think growing up, being born on a reservation, as soon as you leave one, you don't really get to come back. It's a change, you change. It's a different experience. In my mind, I acknowledge and recognize Mandan, Hidatsa people, Lakota people, North Dakota and the Missouri River as like my community. But I don't think I was 100% there. And I was never also allotted 100% access to wherever else I went. And so my interest in community engaged work is to not necessarily cultivate a community for myself, but to reaffirm the importance of that, because I know what it means to be removed from it. I know what it feels like to be outside of it. And so I know the value and the power of it when it's amplified and shared. And so that's kind of my interest and engagement. And I think art is a wonderful way to, as you said, speak truths, truths in multiplicity. People's experiences break down, comprehend, and perceive what it is I make as marks, as memories, as artifacts through their own filter, and decide whether it's honest, whether it's true, or whether it's garbage. You know, that's entirely on a multiplicity of people who see it. It means something entirely different to me. And so I like that ability to say multiple things, and to reaffirm things that I would absolutely disagree with, you know, in the viewer. And I like that. I like that complexity.
All right, just, okay, this works. Thank you so much for giving this talk today. So I'm from Minneapolis, and the linkage between art and activism is something I've been learning a lot about recently in the past year and a half, as well as learning a lot more about the Anishinaabe and Dakota roots of the place I call home. And just like, as somebody from the Midwest, I was curious about what aspects of the environment in that region inspire your work.
This was inspired by that. The mirror shield, literally to protect the water. I'm river people. I also, in a lot of the regalia in future, I do, so these are like the activism, kind of socially engineered projects that we're seeing here. There's a few objects that are extensions of that idea. But I also have an entirely different facet of my art practice, which is called future ancestral technology. And it's indigenous futurism. It's speculative fiction and it's science fiction. And it's really looking at ancestral technologies, because in my definition, once again, redefining things, technology is an idea. What we celebrate presently as I like tech industry, and when we think of technology, we think of our computers and our phones and all of that sort of stuff. That's just a really advanced mechanism of the larynx, you know, capacity to communicate. Bird song is older than our present technology, and it's advanced only in its amplification and not necessarily in its ability to comprehend from one to the next. You know, we're looking at that now as we can transcribe and transmute different languages to one another through some of these systems, but they're a little herky-jerky yet. I would like to see a really true advancement in our communication technology that made it accessible to understand the disparities of a sponge, you know, and on the coastline, you're gonna maybe understand that a little bit better. That would be an interesting technological advancement. So a lot of the work that I'm doing is looking at some of these ancestral technologies, applying them through new materials. And what you'll see is a lot of really bright, kind of vibrant regalia, utilitarian infrastructure built primarily for nomadic existence, what it means to have a nomadic culture, and what it means to actually navigate through the land as an extension of it and adapt to your environmental change versus building a homestead, flattening the earth, planting wheat, you know? So I play around with some of those ideas, and they are extensions of this knowledge, but they're not traditional forms, you know? So I don't even know if the culture I'm imagining is the same culture. But I'm happy to acknowledge that culture has always adapted, changed, and grows. And we're only declaring culture by the moment of contact and the moment of declaration and or reservation period, like when we decided to put people in places. Literally, Lakota, Mandan, all of the tribal names that you've heard literally means the human beings. If you translate it into English, it means the human beings from the river, the human beings who tattoo themselves, the human beings who live in the woods. So this exchange of like a settler colonial narrative and indigenous narrative, they were like, what do you call yourselves? And then they were like, we're the human beings. Like, how do you not see me? You know, but that was confused through translation. And then that became the isolated experience. Now they are not the human beings, they're the Lakota, you know? So I think it's an interesting kind of exchange in that. And I'm always intrigued to consider what it means to advance all of that through. These are examples of ceramic cell phones. I think this is ancestral technology. Like I made them out of clay so that they could be appreciated within the historical indigenous art record, but they're talking about what was happening us to at the time of their creation. And I was like, this becomes a conduit to communicate to my ancestors that are trapped in institutional spaces. I'm like, I need to send a message to tell them how we're doing. And I'm gonna put it on this phone. I'm gonna make it out of clay. I'm gonna bury it in the dirt for like 30 days. I'm gonna dig it out. So now it has forced antiquity. Like, let me give it to the museum. And then now I found a way to utilize this system to transmit ideas to my ancestors that are trapped here. So all of those seem to be extensions of indigenous knowledge, indigenous lifeways, cultural relevance applied through our present new material, our mechanisms for technology, all of that sort of stuff. These are like regalia. These are science fiction regalia for a new myth. But I'm literally carving instead of hunting deer and animal, I've carved into Americana itself, making our regalia out of Afghans that somebody cared for, knitted together with their love, gave away to somebody that they cared for, and then ended up in a thrift store and I bought it for $3. And I'm like, that material is made with love. The leather that I can purchase at like a leather store was brutally harvested. I'm like, we're about care. We're about putting more in than we take out. So I'm interested in harvesting the tradition and the communal spirit of our present. So I'm like, I'm buying Afghans. Like that's the love material that I can build regalia that seems true and honest. And it's made of pure garbage, like just plastic fibers. So I'm like, let me repurpose those from some eventual landfill and turn it into regalia to protect the bodies of these future people, you know? So that's a little bit. And it's so bright. We love peacocking up in the northern plains. I live in the Southwest and like our songs are so different. They're like wild and high and like exuberant up north where I'm from my opinion, granted, compared to like Southern drums and Southern music, but a lot lower, a lot more rhythmic of a drum. We like going wild. We love to peacock. So I'm like, I'm gonna make that regalia emulate that tradition.
Thank you so much. I think you probably already sort of covered this, but I was curious, like if the process of creating art for you is a form of catharsis or a form of trauma, especially when it is then being put on display or you're presenting it to folks who don't have an Indigenous background.
Yes. Yes. There is always something cathartic about it. Like I was mentioning before, you know, I believe we all are artists and then we all desire to create. The stubbornness that makes me continue all of this and putting myself in these positions, even this position is probably the most extractive aspect of my art and life and career. So after I get done today, I'm going to be wiped out. We're going to go have a dinner and do all of that stuff. And all of that for me is the labor, you know, that's the work. The part that I really enjoy is the creation. And because it's not always happy, it's a lot of times really frustrating. Sometimes my wife comes into my studio and it's just like, why do you even do it? You look so tormented. And I'm like, because this I can complete. I'm like, everything else seems so out of control and I can't do anything about it. If I just keep going, I get to like be done at some point. And there's something really exciting about that just for my own mental health, you know? So as difficult as it is, it's also the medicine for what ails me. And because I acknowledge that, it's also why I'm interested in sharing that process, like what it means to go through that joy isn't always happy, you know, that trauma is something we've all experienced in one way or another, and that the trauma that one person experiences is almost like the byproduct of your privilege or my privilege, that somehow as an extension of a beautiful network of living things on this place, what we consume and what we waste and what we find joy in, there is a reciprocation in the other way, and somehow we are affecting one another always, you know? So I'm like, let me do this work in this space in a way that I can feel like it's complete and appreciate the multiplicity of emotional experiences, appreciate the knowledge that's gained through success or through failure, and then learning to adapt for future projects. Like every time I make something, whether it's successful or not as an object, I gained all of the knowledge of working with that material. And I believe that is a collaboration, that regardless of how removed from any sort of natural environment, any synthetic material I'm working with, anything all comes from here, like man-made or otherwise. It is a part of this beautiful network, and that there is an exchange and a knowledge exchange. So as much as I push and mold and manipulate material, it's doing the same to me. And so hopefully on the other side, the material makes me better. You know, that's my thought.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for loaning your art to the museum and for coming here today, despite it being extractive.
I can handle it. I'm happy to be in these spaces because I can. And there's folks who can't, you know, so I'm like, okay, let's do this. So no worries.
I appreciate you taking that one for the team. Okay, this is partly a statement and then partly a question. I'm part of this small collective called Trash Talk Atlanta, where we're trying to take trash and upcycle it into artwork, kind of similar, I think, to what you're doing. And there's this space, I'm not sure how familiar you are with current events in Atlanta, but there's a large forest that's at risk of being developed into
Oh yes, I've heard of this.
Yeah, Cop City, a police training facility. And we want to get involved in that. Our collective wants to help the effort to stop the development of that space. So one idea that we've kind of come up with is to try and attract more visitors to the space, because right now there are a few trails, but it's not very well known or like highly visited area of the city. So we were thinking about maybe installing some art or something that would help attract visitors to the space so that people are aware of the issue and aware of its value and why it shouldn't be developed. But what is your take on installing art to attract more visitors to a space? Is that kind of like what you were talking about earlier, where we're forcing the environment to adapt to us, like by changing the space? Or do you think that the like benefits outweigh the negatives of changing the space to bring more people there?
I think it could. I would encourage you to, rather than invite people to experience the work that you make with it, share the process of making the work in expression to gain awareness around the space itself. That collective effort may have the same level of participation and amplification as you would gain by bringing people into the space to experience it. You can share the same information and share the same, you actually do a better job at sharing information if you work with people. And I know this is a tricky time to do it because of social engagement and social distancing and mask wearing and all of this sort of stuff. But from my experience, doing collaborative projects, especially bringing people in who you don't necessarily think you'll ever agree with, that's who you need to talk to. You need to invite people who are outside of your personal reference so that you're not going to end up talking to the people who are going to come and stand and help and protect anyway. But the act of working together and making together, our hands are our primary defense mechanism. Like, it's the physical manifestation of our mental barriers. And what I found is when you work with people and have them get their hands activated in creating things, by making their hands do stuff, you remove also the mental barriers in their mind because their hands are now busy doing work. And then you end up having these really honest and interesting conversations that are absorbed deep into them without it being them having the capacity to block and deny any sort of insight or input. So I encourage that method. If you're going to make work and put it in the space, build an exit strategy. Like, what do you do afterwards? Don't leave it there, you know, and figure out where it can go from that point. Even documentation of it in spaces, maybe an application. I've definitely done that where I've made things, photographed things, shared the voyeuristic experience of it being in place, and then removing it from the environment so that it doesn't become like waste in that space. That's another kind of methodology that works pretty good too, especially through social media platforms. You can make up an entire exhibition, photograph it well, say, I had a show at the Met, this is all the work that's in it, just using the technologies we have right now, and falsify the entire thing. Like, you could literally build an entire exhibition that's somewhere in those woods. I encourage you to find it. Somewhere deep inside is this imaginary exhibition of artifacts. Get your body down there. Anyone you find, you get to keep. You know, you can do all of that stuff. It's fine. People will forgive you for lying. Yeah, those are just options. Or do it exactly how you're doing it. All of this, everything works eventually.
Thanks for your advice. Kind of
Yeah.
quick follow-up question, just based on what you said. So are none of your pieces currently like on display in
No, I've
nature?
never made anything before in my life. I Photoshop really good. Most of this work, like, I don't know who that is, or where they are. But the reality is 98% of my sculptural objects are viewed on a two-dimensional format. I got involved in working with new media, film, video, because the demand of voyeurism in our present culture is so high, and the accessibility to go into museum spaces is so low and so privileged, that I understand that if I don't learn how to take a good photograph or document an experience well and make it accessible, then I have failed as a communicator, you know? And so with that being said, you can also make it up. Like, it's the internet. Everything's true. Yeah. There's real stuff across the hallway, in case you were wondering.
Okay, I think we can continue on forever, but I was curious if we can just have one more question from
Yep.
Zoom, unless there is one burning question from the floor. Okay. So Nicole asks, you have done so much fascinating work making use of people's collective energy, judging us all a bit closer to the front lines. What are you interested in pursuing right now?
Warm meal. I think I have quite a few things that are, there's always things in the works. I'll be honest, as a part of the artist practice, every year I cast out a large net. And sometimes I bring in nothing. Sometimes I get one thing. but then I figure out how to put everything into it. And I think since the pandemic, there has been a drive for me on a personal level to do less. This is how my brother from another culture expressed it. Do less, more, better. Like, I love that combination of words. That's what I'm interested in. How can I, because I get wrapped up, I get charged. I love to make things. So oftentimes I drive myself into the ground. And prior to the pandemic, I saw myself beginning to list on the burnout kind of level, because I kept thinking that the demand, I was too focused on the demand and rather than what it meant to me personally, what's important to me. And so I think what I'm most interested right now in is recognizing the community that I have, which is my family. I've got a lovely wife and 2 little boys. So much of my work and labor draws me away from them. That absence is how I justify the value of the work that I make. I'm like, the work that I make takes me away from that family. So how much does that cost to me? What I'm interested in now is how can I produce the work that I love to produce and simultaneously cultivate this relationship of the actual community that cares for me, don't undermine that, and actually figure out how to learn from that exchange. And we had just got done doing a project in the Northeast where a part of this future ancestral technology projects that I've been playing around with, that I've been filming, they're like these little excerpts, little diary logs of a nomadic culture. I decided that my family would be that nomadic culture. And so we literally go camping in like post-industrial sites across North America. And that's a way for us to kind of like go on camping trips and make art simultaneously. So it's like me, my wife, and my 2 boys all wearing super tripped out, weird sci-fi regalia, and living in a variety of structures that are built out of repurposed materials and things like that. And then we document it with film crews sometimes. And then that gets edited together and is shared as an art project, art experience. Also a beacon into our dark future that we're all facing of hope and resilience and indigenous value, as kind of the culmination of many different thought ways applied. So that's what I'm kind of most interested in right now, is that.
Here for me to be able to actually give you a round of applause because we usually on the webinar we cannot. So
give it to me.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I think we've learned so much from this conversation. I think what really was fascinating to me is your honest conversations. And I really want to thank you for telling us that we are doomed, but still there is hope. And I think we really want to strive to have these honest conversations and try to really form the communities that he's told us about. So thank you so much. We are going to continue the conversation on December 2nd with the Prime Minister of Barbados. And I hope you would also listen to the Amplifier, the podcast that we make.
Come into the camera zone. We can stand by each other. It's okay. We're on Zoom as well.
Okay. So yeah, I hope you can join us. I really liked you say about amplifying. And even though we are so privileged at this institution as well, we are really trying to amplify as well. And so I hope you will listen to that. One of the episodes is really about bringing the indigenous voices, and also about the COP26 of the youth power. So thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Let's all do our part to be honest. That was amazing. You are so such a great